Lecture 19, The Enlightenment and Rejection of Papal Authority. The previous lecture was on the Age of Discovery, which was followed by missionary activity. This lecture, 19, will be on a following historical period, the Age of Enlightenment. This era roughly spans from the death of René Descartes in 1650 to the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789. We will not adhere strictly to these dates, which are a bit arbitrary. The dates are only to serve as an aid in recognizing noticeable movements within history. During the time of enlightenment, reason was emphasized, often excessively to the detriment of faith. Not surprisingly, this era was in turn followed by a Romantic era whose accent was on emotion and was also detriment to the Catholic faith, as particularly evident during the French Revolution. In discussing the Age of Enlightenment, we will first focus on some of the key scientists of the era: René Descartes, Francis Bacon, Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo Galilei, and Isaac Newton. Then, you will be introduced to several Enlightenment ideas on human nature, on God, and on the Pope. Enlightenment scientists. René Descartes lived from 1596 to 1650. Descartes was a French-born philosopher and mathematician who defined truth from the perspective of individual judgment without any reliance on external authority. This is represented in his well-known phrase, "I think, therefore I am." Francis Bacon. While the Frenchman Descartes was grounding his approach to truth in the individual mind, the English empiricist Francis Bacon was searching for truth by examining the world perceived by his senses. His empirically based methodology for ascertaining certainty has been called the Baconian method. The modern scientific method is a further development of the Baconian method. With his Baconian inductive method, starting from the specific with the hope of discovering a general principle, Francis Bacon also distanced himself from seeking truth by relying on the authority of another. In describing his method, Bacon writes this, I quote, "Our method, though difficulty to practice, is easy to formulate. It is to establish degrees of certainty, to preserve sensation by putting a kind of restraint on it, but to reject in general the work of the mind that follows sensation, and rather to open and construct a new and certain road for the mind from the actual perceptions of the senses." Nicholas Copernicus lived from 1473 and died in 1543. The Polish mathematician and astronomer Copernicus unintentionally contributed to the Age of the Enlightenment's doubt of external authority and excessive reliance on empirically based science. In his On the Revolution of the Celestial Spheres, Copernicus provided convincing evidence that the Earth is not at the center of the known universe. Instead, based on research, he argued that the Sun is at the center of the known universe, with his heliocentric theory. This sun-centered explanation was not a brand new conception of the cosmos. As far back as the ancient Greeks, beginning with the Greek astronomer Aristarchus, who lived from 310 to 230 BC, this theory has been circulating. Up until Copernicus' day, the dominant explanation for the order of the universe, though, was the one proposed by the Greco-Egyptian Ptolemy. According to Ptolemy's account, the Earth and not the Sun is at the center of the universe. Later, the German scientist Johannes Kepler eliminated the need for epicycles within the Copernican system by proposing elliptical orbits, with the Sun at the focal point and not the exact center of planetary orbits. The Jesuit astronomer Guy Consolmagno, he's a current one, points out that in proposing the Earth at the center of the universe did not mean to Copernicus, Kepler, or later Galileo that the Earth was the central most important place of reality. Rather, the Earth was seen more at the bottom of the universe in the common sense approach of identifying what is heavenly as above and what is earthly as below. Unlike Galileo Galilei, Copernicus was not corrected by the Catholic Church for providing evidence that the sun and not the earth is at the center of the then known cosmos. The reason is quite simple. Copernicus did not present his view as certain, but rather as a possible explanation that needed further confirmation. Due to his diplomatic and careful approach in reintroducing the heliocentric theory, the prominent Cardinal of Capua, Cardinal Nicholas Schönberg, even allowed an affirming letter of Copernicus to be published after the foreword of Copernicus's 1543 book on the revelation of the celestial spheres. And I include an important excerpt of that letter. Copernicus also displayed his diplomatic skills in his preface by dedicating his book to Pope Paul III. Why was diplomacy so critical in presenting this heliocentric explanation? The answer to this question becomes clearer when we remember that Copernicus was living during the same time as Martin Luther and the beginnings of the Protestant movement. It was imperative for the Catholic Church to be very careful in how the heliocentric theory was publicly presented, so that Protestants would not be given additional reasons to criticize the Catholic Church. Even so, in 1616, well after Copernicus had died, the Catholic Church, for prudential reasons, placed Copernicus's On the Revolution of the Celestial Spheres on her index of forbidden books. Not until 1835 was this book removed from the index. Galileo Galilei lived from 1564 to 1642. The Italian astronomer Galileo lacked Copernicus's diplomatic approach in promoting the heliocentric explanation of the cosmos. His lack of tact is particularly evident in his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, in which the character Simplicio, simpleton, speaks words that Pope Urban VIII had said. Needless to say, this mockery greatly angered Pope Urban VIII. Subsequently, Galileo was tried by the Inquisition, found suspect of heresy, forced to recant, and consigned to house arrest. The Church punished Galileo for the following reasons. Many churchmen thought that it was not yet the opportune time for the heliocentric theory to be presented as a fact for a whole host of reasons, including the following. More data was needed to confirm this theory. Protestants might accuse the Catholic Church of promoting an explanation that had yet been sufficiently proven and that seemed to contradict sacred scripture. Many believe that the universe revolves around the earth and not the sun. Finally, before the Church could express openness to the heliocentric theory, she needed to carefully deal with passages of sacred scripture that phenomenologically describe the sun as revolving around the earth. And phenomenologically simply means as it appears to the eye. And we know simply because something appears to the eye doesn't mean that is actually how it operates. Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727. The English mathematician and physicist Isaac Newton is the last key scientist of the Age of Enlightenment who will be briefly discussed. Some of his accomplishments include developing calculus, finding further evidence that the heliocentric theory is valid, and formulating laws of motion and of gravitation. His three laws of motions, based on the simple principle that all material things move according to the same physical laws, overturned Aristotle's view that heavy bodies are naturally inclined downward, lighter bodies naturally move upwards, heavenly bodies naturally move in circles, and in order for something to be moved, motion needs to be continually imparted to it. Aristotle's conclusions seem to be in accordance with common sense. After all, does not smoke rise and dirt when dropped fall? In contrast, according to Newton, and as confirmed by modern science, every material object continues in either a state of rest or motion unless affected by force. The degree of change in motion of an object in motion is proportional to the force acting on it. And finally, every action always entails an equal and opposite reaction. Once Newtonian physics replaced Aristotelian physics, theologians began to describe theological realities in a slightly different manner. For example, significantly prior to Newton's law of motion, the early church fathers, St. Augustine, in accordance with the then common sense approach to physics, later identified as Aristotelian, described love in terms of weight. In his Confessions, he writes, "My weight is my love," meaning that if we love heavenly things, we will naturally float upward to heaven, but if we love earthly things, we will sink like a rock downward away from heaven. And I'm going to give you a little quote from St. Augustine's pre-Newtonian influenced theology. "A body gravitates to its proper place by its own weight. This weight does not necessarily drag it downward, but pulls it to the place proper to it. Thus fire tends upward and a stone downward. Drawn by their weight, things seek their rightful places. Now my weight is my love, and wherever I am carried, it is this weight that carries me." Enlightenment ideas and movement. Human nature is pure. During the age of enlightenment, many became so confident in their enlightened state that they began looking down upon the previous era by naming it the Dark Ages. Calling the previous era a dark one implied that the people living during this dark time were mentally shackled by superstitions, traditions, and hence unenlightened. Another manifestation of Enlightenment era pride was the conviction that circumstances determine human vice. If some claimed the social environment abides by Enlightenment principles, then crime, suffering, and poverty will disappear from human societies. The Genevan-born philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau grounded this claim by denying original sin. According to Rousseau in his treatise on education, and I quote, "There is no original sin in the human heart." End of quote. Human nature is completely corrupt. The modern ideology of political realism, founded by Hans Joachim Morgenthau, which denies the existence of a moral law between the nation-states, is like the political Enlightenment views of the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes' approach to politics was even more pessimistically realistic, since he denied the existence of a morality other than might makes right, unless a person was living within a political structure. As is evident, his political approach differs from the previously mentioned Rousseau. According to Hobbes, when people are left to follow their natures, unhindered by a political state, they will naturally wage war with one another. This is because, he contended, war defines human nature. Since Hobbes equates the state of nature with the state of war, he describes all political arrangements as artificial. Only when men, through means of a social contract, begin to live within a political structure does morality apply. Outside of agreed upon political structures, he argued, there is no morality. It doesn't exist. In this natural state, life, claims Hobbes, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This radically negative view of human nature directly contradicts the Catholic position of St. Thomas Aquinas, who maintained that political communities are natural. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, man is naturally a civic and social animal. Unjust, nasty, brutal elements that are present within political societies are not an indication that these elements are prior to political societies, but rather are an indication of man's tendency to sin, since he is wounded but not corrupted by original sin. Even though our attraction to good has been distorted by sin, nonetheless the Catholic Church affirms that with the help of healing and sanctifying grace, our sinful, selfish, brutal tendencies can be diminished. God does not care about nature. The Enlightenment deists also perceive nature in an obviously non-Catholic manner. According to the deists, God leaves the world to its own devices. He does not consequently maintain the deists. intervene, or miraculously suspend the natural laws of the universe. Some of the deists formed themselves into fraternities known as Freemasonry. Freemasonry has repeatedly been condemned by the Catholic Church. In 1738, by Pope Clement XII in Amenensi, in 1890 by Pope Leo XIII in Ab Apostolochi, in Canon 2335 of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, and indirectly in the 1983 Code of Canon Law. Shortly after the publication of the 1983 Code of Canon Law, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, as head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, clarified the Code's implied reference to Freemasons by writing, "It has been asked whether there has been any change in the Church's decision in regard to Masonic associations, since the new Code of Canon Law does not mention them expressly, unlike the previous code. The Church's negative judgment in regard to Masonic association remains unchanged, since their principles have always been considered irreconcilable with the doctrine of the Church, and therefore membership in them is forbidden. The faithful who enroll in Masonic associations are in a state of grave sin and may not receive Holy Communion." Rejection of papal authority. Gallicanism. The anti-papal authority Enlightenment movement, known as Gallicanism, was named after the ancient Roman province of Gaul, that very roughly corresponds to modern-day France. Supporters of Gallicanism claimed that papal authority does not overrule either French secular authority or the authority of French bishops. Gallicanism was officially formalized by Louis XIV in 1682, when 4 articles were published and distributed in his name. And these anti-papal articles are listed. I'm going to list them as follows. 1, that the ecclesiastical power has no right over the temporalities of the kingdom. 2, that a general council is superior to the Pope as decided by the Council of Constance. 3, that the exercise of the papal power should be controlled by canons and local customs. And 4, that the judgment of the Pope is not infallible except when confirmed by the Church. Febronianism. Another anti-papal Enlightenment movement is Febronianism. It received its name from the pseudonym of a principal founder, the German Nicholas von Hohenheim. Like Gallicanism, Febronianism held that a general council is superior to the Pope and that papal authority does not extend into the territory of local bishops. Out of 26 German bishops, only 10 agreed to publish and disseminate a condemnation of Febronius issued by Rome. Not until Vatican Council I, when papal infallibility was defined, was Febronianism and Gallicanism substantially weakened. Josephinism. Josephinism was yet another anti-papal Enlightenment movement. This movement received its name after the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II. In 1773, he decreed that he was responsible for determining the charitable and religious purposes of all church property. In 1781, he suppressed contemplative monasteries, which he believed were useless since they served no practical purpose. Then, in 1782, he began establishing state-run seminaries and forbade the teaching of scholasticism at his general seminaries. Finally, in 1782, he even claimed a quasi-papal gift in infallibility, as is evident in his own words. Joseph II can be understood as embodying the absolute monarch who received his power from a social contract that the Enlightenment political writer Thomas Hobbes advocated in his Leviathan. The few ways mentioned by which Joseph II controlled the church was part of his overall scheme to unify his state by centralizing power in himself as the one absolute sovereign. And this is an excerpt of Joseph II letter to Pope Pius VI. He states this, in claiming that he has infallibility as well, without having to search the texts of Holy Scriptures or of the Fathers, which in any case are always subject to interpretations and explanations. I, that is Joseph II, have a voice inside me that tells me what, as legislator and protector of religion, it is proper for me to do and to leave undone. And it seems to me that this voice of mine, with the help of God's grace and honest and equitable character that I feel I have, can never lead to error. End of quote. God bless.